China just hit the US with a brutal 125% counterpunch after Trump imposed $88 billion in tariffs. They targeted US exports where it hurts most: high-tech, agriculture, and manufacturing, and within hours, markets tumbled. Companies lost billions and panic spread throughout DC. But what escalated things even worse was the silence from US allies. None stepped up to help. Instead, they were cutting deals with China, ditching the dollar, and distancing themselves from Washington. This is more than just a trade war. It's a global power shift. As China gains momentum, countries are quietly rewiring the global economy, trading oil in yuan, building payment networks outside SWIFT, and bypassing the US dollar. The fallout from China's retaliation is reshaping the global balance of power as exports are abandoning the White House. But what led to all of this? And how deeply does it go? Let's find out. The $40 billion blindside. In a move that stunned economists, Beijing targeted $40 billion worth of US exports with surgical accuracy. It was a move the US never saw coming. The first hit was automobiles. American-made vehicles now face up to 35% import duties in China, cutting demand overnight. Detroit giants like Ford and GM lost billions in market value within 48 hours. Then came semiconductors, the core of America's tech exports. China, the world's largest chip consumer, struck deals with South Korea and Taiwan, freezing out US suppliers like Intel and Qualcomm. The biggest blow, however, was to agriculture. Soybeans, corn, and beef obliterated. Midwest farmers were furious. In Iowa, soybean exports plummeted by nearly 65% in a week. In Texas, machinery orders vanished. In Michigan, auto parts distributors reported contract losses stretching into 2026. Publicly, Trump remained tough. "We'll win this trade war, easy," he told reporters, but behind the scenes, chaos erupted. White House insiders leaked frantic calls between Trump and Wall Street executives. The message was clear: get the markets under control, fast. Treasury officials scrambled to reassure investors as the Dow plunged 900 points in a single day. "This wasn't a counter," said economist Dr. Elaine Portman. "This was an economic ambush, planned, timed, and weaponized." Others agreed. China hit the US where it's most vulnerable: its supply chains and its political base. This wasn't economics. This was strategy, said Marcus Bell, senior trade analyst at East West Economics. Trump's inner circle reportedly fractured over how to respond. Some pushed for harsher tariffs, while others urged de-escalation. But China had already drawn blood, and US allies were watching closely. The worst part? The dollar wasn't the shield it used to be. Central banks in Europe and Asia began trimming their dollar reserves. Saudi Arabia and India, once reliable trade partners, started testing transactions in yuan. This ambush was bigger than trade. It was a warning shot. The most shocking part of China's strategy was their attempt to undermine the US dollar, the very currency that's held the global economy together for decades. With allies already wavering, the dollar's reign was suddenly in question, and at a level no one had ever seen. The dollar defection. As the trade war escalated, something quietly dangerous was happening behind the headlines: a shift away from the US dollar. By 2025, China had slashed its holdings of US Treasury bonds to the lowest level in 15 years, reducing its exposure to American debt by hundreds of billions of dollars. It was a subtle move, but one that sent a chilling message to Wall Street and Washington. China wasn't just fighting a trade war, it was preparing to decouple. China's strategy didn't stop with Treasury bonds. Beijing began pulling the strings in the global financial system. State-owned giants like China Construction Bank and ICBC stopped offering US dollar loans for Chinese-backed projects. Instead, they shifted to the renminbi and even the euro for international transactions. In short, China was building a parallel financial system, one that didn't depend on Washington's approval. "This isn't just economics," explained analyst James Young. "It's a strategic retreat from US influence, a financial realignment, and the West has barely noticed." The ripple effects were quickly felt in Europe and the Middle East. Germany, once a key ally of the US, was quietly signing new trade deals with China, cementing its own ties to the rising power. Saudi Arabia, the heart of the petrodollar system, made a shocking move. For the first time in history, it sold oil using China's digital yuan, bypassing the US dollar entirely. The US was losing its grip, and China was seizing the moment to rewrite the financial rules of the game. While China's economic ambush left America reeling, the fallout wasn't confined to US borders. As the tariffs hit, something even more dangerous started to unfold. America's closest allies began to jump ship. The US was no longer the only player in the game, and those who once stood by Washington's side were now quietly making moves to cut ties with the dollar. And that's where the chaos gets even crazier. Allies in retreat. It started with Germany. The European powerhouse made headlines when its chemical giant BASF made its largest ever investment outside of Europe, in China. Despite pressure from the US to limit business dealings with Beijing, Germany chose the future, not the past. They were just the beginning. Across the Atlantic, France wasn't far behind. As the country looked to secure its economic future, it began eyeing the BRICS nations, the coalition of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, forming ties that could bypass the traditional financial systems. France, eager to stay ahead, asked to become an observer at the BRICS meetings, signaling a shift in allegiance. But the biggest shock came from Saudi Arabia. For decades, the kingdom had been entrenched in the US-dominated petrodollar system, selling oil exclusively in dollars. But in a move that stunned the world, Saudi Arabia sold oil in China's digital yuan for the first time ever. This was more than just a technical shift. It was a direct challenge to US economic dominance. Suddenly, Washington wasn't just facing a trade war, it was witnessing the unraveling of a global order it had spent decades building. And while Trump scrambled to react, the world was shifting beneath his feet. What came next was the hardest blow yet. America wasn't just losing allies, it was losing control of the global economic system. As America's allies peeled away and China's economic assault deepened, the US found itself facing an even more troubling reality. The very sanctions it had relied on for decades to maintain global control were now backfiring. The economic weapons Washington had used to force compliance were now losing their bite, and China, along with its growing network of allies, was proving that the world no longer needed to play by the old rules. Trump now had to scramble for new alternatives on how to salvage the situation, but the more he tried, the worse it got. Sanctions backfire. Trump's administration had used sanctions as its go-to strategy: cut off trade, freeze assets, and isolate countries that didn't fall in line. But now, the reality was hitting hard. China, under mounting sanctions, was thriving. In fact, Chinese exports to Southeast Asia surged by 16.6% in the first quarter of 2025, proving that Beijing was adapting faster than Washington could impose restrictions. The real blow to the US came when Chinese tech giant Huawei, long a target of US sanctions, pulled off a remarkable feat. It developed a 7-nanometer chip, a technological breakthrough that was supposed to be impossible without American or European expertise. The chip was developed with older machines and new techniques, showing that sanctions were not slowing China down. If anything, they were accelerating Chinese innovation. What Washington had never anticipated was how quickly China could turn pressure into power. As America tried to use its economic clout to isolate China, Beijing responded by doubling down on self-sufficiency. China began ramping up domestic production of critical goods like semiconductors and cutting its reliance on US suppliers. The result? China was now not just surviving, it was thriving outside the reach of American sanctions. The US was now staring down the very real possibility that sanctions, once a reliable tool of power, were becoming obsolete. As China found new markets, innovative workarounds, and partners willing to bypass US sanctions, America's ability to shape the global order was crumbling. The question was no longer whether China could weather the storm, it was whether the US could survive in a world where its influence was diminishing by the day. And while there was a desperate quest for answers, China had a more devious strategy at hand to unleash. The long game. China's plan isn't just tariffs. While the headlines screamed about tariffs and trade wars, the truth was far more unsettling. China wasn't just responding with retaliation, it was repositioning itself for a future beyond America's reach. The $88 billion tariff showdown was merely the opening act. Beneath the surface, China was executing a long-term strategy that aimed not just to challenge the US, but to decouple from the American-led global order entirely. First, there was the move that rattled Washington's financial nerve. China began dumping US treasuries. By early 2025, China had slashed its holdings of US government bonds to $760 billion, a sharp decline from previous years. The move wasn't just a response to trade hostilities, it was a signal. China was unwinding its financial entanglements with the US, reducing its reliance on the dollar, and beginning to chart its own course on the global economic map. What started as a trade spat was now unfolding as a financial decoupling. Meanwhile, Beijing was bolstering its domestic capabilities in key areas like microchips, targeting one of America's most vulnerable industries. With American sanctions on Chinese tech companies intensifying, China has already made significant strides in self-reliance. The country was rapidly increasing its domestic chip production, up by 34% annually, cutting down its dependence on US semiconductor giants like Intel and Qualcomm. If China could maintain this trajectory, it would not just close the gap on tech, it would leap ahead, cutting America out of the high-tech supply chains that had long been a core pillar of US economic power. But it didn't stop there. China was expanding the yuan's role in global trade. Beijing had already made major inroads in international markets like oil, metals, and grains, using the yuan to sidestep the US dollar. By signing trade agreements with key partners, China was ensuring that more and more global transactions could bypass the dollar entirely. Oil, once traded exclusively in US dollars, was now increasingly settled in the digital yuan, a powerful move that would further undermine the dollar's dominance. The true game changer, however, was China's digital currency. The yuan's digital counterpart, backed by China's central bank, wasn't just a new form of money, it was a programmable payment system that could bypass global financial systems like SWIFT, which had given the US unprecedented control over international payments. This digital currency allowed China to move money more freely, without the need for intermediaries, and crucially, without needing the approval of Washington. It was a digital economic weapon that opened new avenues for global transactions, outside the reach of US sanctions. As the world watched, Chinese officials began to hint at the real aim behind these moves. One strategist, speaking under condition of anonymity, boldly stated, "We are no longer living in a post-Cold War era, we are entering a post-American order." It was a chilling acknowledgement that China was preparing for a future where US influence was a shadow of its former self, and the world would be shaped by new economic powers. China's long game wasn't just about winning a trade war, it was about shifting the tectonic plates of global power. While America was preoccupied with tariffs and sanctions, Beijing was quietly but relentlessly setting the stage for a world where China, not the US, called the shots. Trump's panic, a president in crisis. As China's strategic moves unfolded, Trump's panic became palpable. What began as a tariff skirmish quickly morphed into a full-blown economic crisis. The White House, once brimming with confidence, was now scrambling to respond to an economic war that seemed out of control. Trump, always known for his bravado, now found himself facing a scenario that threatened more than just his trade policies. It threatened his legacy and his grip on power. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings were held with top economic advisors, Wall Street executives, and military officials. Leaked reports suggested that Trump was blindsided by China's financial decoupling. The US economy was teetering, with stock markets plummeting and manufacturing states like Michigan and Iowa bearing the brunt of the trade war. The political fallout was equally brutal as congressional allies began questioning the administration's approach. In public, Trump attempted to play it off, blaming China for everything, but the cracks were starting to show. His public outbursts, including rants about unfair trade practices and China's hidden agenda, only amplified the sense of crisis. Was this a tactical maneuver, or had the president lost control? What was certain was that the stakes were higher than ever, and Trump was fighting a battle on multiple fronts, with no easy solution in sight. Is the US fighting the wrong war with the wrong weapons? As China accelerates its push for a new world order, America faces a pivotal choice: double down on old tools like tariffs and sanctions, or adapt to a rapidly shifting global landscape. The stakes are high, and the world is watching. And Trump may be freaking out, but the rest of the world has already moved on. While the US struggles to contain the fallout from its trade war, China and its allies are quietly building new systems, leaving the dollar behind and exploring alternative ways to trade and interact. This isn't just about tariffs and trade deals. It's about the world America helped build and whether it still has a place in it. The question isn't whether the US can win this battle, it's whether America can even keep up with the global shifts happening right now. So will America adjust in time, or is it too late?